Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing really well. I'd like to take a second to thank you for your patience and your cooperation during this semester. I can imagine that a lot of you are dealing with a lot, and I just want to let you know that if there's anything I can do to help you out, to support you, I'm here for you. Please send me an email and I'm happy to help in any way I can. The college does have information and resources in order to help students, and you're entitled to them as well. So please, if there's anything I can do, please send me an email and I'm happy to help you allocate whatever resources you may need. The first lecture in this class is just giving an overview of how the class is set up, what to be looking for as far as the points of view, I guess you could say, when looking at assessment. In the past, the course has been taught from the point of view of the teacher, meaning that the class meant for us as teachers to go through a certain type of assessment process, looking for evidence of student learning, trying to quantify it, trying to communicate feedback to students depending on what their needs are, reassessing, etc. This year, as we look at classroom assessment, and by the way, that's what CA stands for in the slides, is that not only should we look at assessment processes of the teacher, but also trying to get the learner to engage in more self-regulation so that the learner can start to give themselves feedback. What we mean by self-regulation is that the student goes through and starts to engage in specific tasks. How do they self-correct? How are they aware of the kind of work that they're doing? How are they aware of mistakes that they had made in the past that they want to avoid in the future? What does good work look like? Etc. So it's kind of trying to balance the point of view of the teacher along with the point of view of the student, instead of just the typical discrete approach that we've always used in this class in the past. So this is the classroom assessment conceptual model, and we're going to be breaking down the course into 4 major components. First is the pre-assessment, and this is kind of for the teacher getting ready for instruction and also for the student in drawing their own a priori knowledge, prior experiences, schema, however you want to look at it, into the new instruction so that they can build a more relational understanding of the material. Then it's going to go into the cycle of instruction, looking at formative assessment, what happens sort of in the process of it all, as students are in various levels of learning, as the teachers are in various points of the curriculum, what are the pros and cons of different types of assessment that teachers can give students, and how do we choose the best kind of assessment for them. Then finally going into more of a summative type of work by looking at the final student artifact or this final student performance, and then finally going and doing some summarizing of the performance. For the teachers, it'll be in the form of grades or marks, a lot of people call them, and how those marks will communicate various degrees of masteries to a variety of stakeholders, and also for the student to go back and self-reflect on what they've done so that they can move forward into new material by solidifying the new knowledge, having it become prior knowledge so that future knowledge can sort of have something to grasp onto. So the first point of view I want to give is from the point of view of a teacher. As a teacher, when we're looking at classroom assessment, there's a variety of things that we want to consider. How are you going to decide what they're going to learn? Usually it becomes you're using some sort of standard or blueprint. If you're in the arts, you're probably going to be using some sort of blueprint. If you're a science or social studies teacher, the state will have guidelines depending on what state you're in, depending on what grade you're teaching, of different things that kind of fold into the curriculum. If you're a math or ELA teacher, you're most likely going to use the Common Core State Standards. And then how are students going to be learning this? What kind of pedagogy are you going to be using? And then starting to think about how these greater concepts need to be broken down into more specific knowledge and skills. In addition to that, we also want to know why we're actually engaging in classroom assessment. Of course, we want the students to develop intellectual knowledge, and we want to make sure that they're attaining that knowledge. But also, we want to know if we can make sound decisions about what our students need and also what our teaching needs. How do we need to change things up so that we can clarify any misconceptions that students are obtaining? The next component would be the how of classroom assessment, and how do we know what and how students are learning. And as I said, that's going to be a few lectures down the road where we start to look at various modes of classroom assessment and the pros and cons for each. We'll find that there are pros and cons for every type of assessment. It boils down to things like how much time you have, the age of your student, the discipline of your courses. Something that a business teacher might have to assess is going to be very different than something than maybe a music teacher will have to assess, or a foreign language teacher will have to assess, or a writing teacher will have to assess. And depending on what kind of discipline you're in, what kind of teacher you are, or what kind of things you teach, you'll see that various modes of assessment are better and worse. And sometimes we really want to look at various forms of assessment to see if we can find something that will lend some reliability to past assessments. Are they able to replicate the mastery to see if they're retaining things, or to see if the original results were valid and reliable? And finally, when are we assessing? Well, we're really assessing all the time, right? We're doing some sort of pre-assessing. We're probably assessing throughout the instructional unit. And then even after, we are assessing, usually for summative reasons. So this is a quote that I like to use when we're thinking about constructs. So it says, if a thing exists, it exists in some amount. And if it exists in some amount, it can be measured. And that's by Thorndike. When we think about assessment, really what we're trying to do is we're trying to obtain information. And in education, usually we're trying to obtain information about knowledge, attributes, perceptions, behaviors, and it doesn't just have to be with students. As teachers, you're also being assessed. Schools and programs are also being assessed. In order for us to assess things, we need to come up with some measure. And so for our purposes, we're going to define measurement as being a systematic process for assigning numbers to an attribute or characteristic. Certain things that we measure are obvious, things like weight and height. We can actually see those things, but some constructs cannot be seen. These are things like math achievement, reading comprehension, motivation, self-efficacy. They can be things that are a little bit more common that you hear more about in day-to-day life, like love or depression or happiness. Constructs have to be operationally defined because we cannot see these things. In education, most of the time we cannot see the things that we're trying to measure. You cannot see math achievement. You cannot see reading comprehension. What you can do is you can have the students engage in behaviors that are aligned with the construct and then measure those behaviors. That will give you evidence that you can assess. And if you're able to get many assessments, many pieces of evidence, then you can make an overall evaluation about the student's attainment of a particular construct. As I said, we assess constructs in education, and for the most part, these constructs that we are supposed to assess come to us in the form of standards. They can be the Common Core State Standards. As I said, for social studies and science, usually the New York State standards are specific per state, more so for social studies than for science. And then there's also the blueprints for the arts, for the visual arts, for the performing arts. And then also if you were in an international baccalaureate, I think they call it IB schools, they also have their own set of standards that they go by. The constructs that we want to measure are usually defined somewhere in those documents. We operationalize those constructs by writing specific learning objectives. And so what a specific learning objective will do, it will actually state the behavior that you're expecting the student to do or to engage in to demonstrate to you that they have learned something. And that will give you evidence for ultimately making an evaluation about the student. If this seems a little bit vague, totally get it. We will actually be talking more about constructs and specific learning objectives in our second lecture. The next little quote that I'm going to put up here is, why do we measure or test? This is Lord Kelvin. If I am speaking to any science teachers in cyberspace, perhaps you've heard of Kelvin, who came up with the Kelvin scale. His quote is, if you haven't measured it, you don't know what you're talking about. Looking at the why we assess in schools, what are we trying to do? So first, if we were looking for one of the reasons why we might measure things in school is because we want to identify instructional needs for the whole class. So that for the teacher's point of view, we want to be able to plan and monitor and pace ourselves. We want to be able to understand the individual learner's needs, be able to give the student the individual constructive feedback that they need in order to get better. We also need to assess so that we can make instructional decisions, like assigning marking period grade. We might also decide that we should assess because students will need to be placed in different types of classes. If I know a lot of you will be teaching in high schools, and some of your students may be considered to take advanced placement classes, or they may be selected for specialized tracks. We need some sort of assessment in order to make these decisions, to have some sort of evidence that we base decisions off of. These assessments that we're going to be doing will ultimately result in grades, and those will follow students to colleges that they may be considering going into following their graduation. There's times where we need to assign students to special classifications. So students that are having to be assessed possibly for some sort of learning disability, if their IEP needs to be updated, whatever it is, that's another reason why we have to assess in schools. And then finally, we're assessing teachers, we're assessing programs, we're assessing schools, we're assessing how well the state is performing relative to other states. So there's lots of reasons why we want to assess in schools and why it's important to assess in schools, but also because we want to be able to have some evidence about what arguments we're trying to make and be able to have the resources we need in order to help students. For the purposes of our class, we're going to define what a test is. And a test is just an instrument that is going to result in some sort of measurement. It can either be scores, maybe like a point system or a percentage system, but then it can also be categories. Depending on when you started teaching, there's been a variety of categories. When I started teaching, we used to have below basic, basic, proficient, and advanced. Now I think they have like approaching and mastery. They have different categories. Even if you think of A, B, C, D, and F, those are categories. They're not actual scores. You can have scores that equal a particular grade or category, but the grades themselves are just categories. They should be used systematically to obtain information. When you're deciding how to quantify or classify a particular attribute, then it should be meant to be able to measure something that is useful to you. And so when we get to rubrics, we'll be able to kind of talk a little bit about making some decisions about how to measure something that is useful to you, and so far as being able to calculate grades, but then also being able to communicate with the various stakeholders in a student's achievement. When you have a lot of assessments, the idea of bringing lots of assessments together, maybe tests, maybe performance, maybe a project, lots of different pieces of information can be used to come together to make a value judgment about the quality of a student's product or performance. And evaluations are the basis for either formative evaluation or summative evaluation. Formative evaluation means that you're judging the quality of a student's achievement while the student is still in the process of learning so that they can improve, or so that you can also improve your teaching. The summative evaluation is that you're judging the quality of a student's achievement for the purposes of reporting. That information is sort of not necessarily going to be improved upon. Now, there are situations where you might consider something to be both formative and summative, and sometimes you might be doing something like that's kind of neither. So I'll give you an example. I have worked with a lot of teachers that use exit slips. an exit slips, if you don't already know. Most people do, but just in case somebody's listening that doesn't already know, an exit slip is a quick question or two that a student would answer at the end of class so that the teacher has some idea if they were able to understand the lesson and then plan in advance. I know a lot of teachers that give exit slips, but then do not act upon the information, or they don't grade them. In those cases, the exit slip is neither formative or summative. It's nothing, because there was no action taken upon the exit slip. My advice to any teacher is, if you're going to give an exit slip, then make sure that you have the time in order to look it over and make decisions about it. Otherwise, perhaps there's another way that you can do something that may be quicker or maybe a little bit less cumbersome and that you are able to do, or just skip it altogether. Because otherwise you're just kind of making more work for yourself by giving the student something that you're not going to act upon. And they're under the impression that you are. So this is kind of a relationship between assessment and evaluation. As I said, lots of assessments creates an evaluation. Assessments can be all kinds. They can have just tests that can be non-tests. So like a performance is a non-test. You can have different types of classification schemes or numerical scales. But the big takeaway here is you need more than one assessment to make an evaluation. So now that we're kind of done talking about teacher's perspective, I want to move to talking about evaluation and assessment through the lens of a student. So as I said, the change to this class in the last semester is trying to move away of just what is the teacher doing and kind of starting to also look at what does the student need to do. In life, we don't always have somebody giving us feedback, and we want the students to kind of get to the point where they're starting to take the responsibility of looking at the caliber of their work and being able to self-correct to avoid problems or improve. And really that idea comes from self-regulation, the idea of generating thoughts to yourselves and starting to move towards behaviors that are oriented to attaining goals. So for example, I'm sure you've noticed by now that I say so and therefore I say that stuff too much. You're probably very annoyed by my voice by now. I get it. Even though I'm really trying to make my speech more clear, I try to avoid falling into habits. It's a purposeful thing that I'm going through. In my mind, I'm saying, take your time, try not to say certain words to fill the space. You can always cut out a pause later. It's much easier to cut out an area where I'm not speaking as much than constantly be trying to cut out every time I say or so or and. All these things that I tend to go to because I might get nervous and the silence is making me more nervous. It's adding to my anxiety of messing up. As I go through these self-regulatory behaviors, maybe I'm not getting better, but I'm trying to make myself a better presenter, looking for ways that I can improve, being aware of my mistakes. Ultimately, that's what we want the students to start to engage in. This is not something that students can necessarily do by themselves. They need to start to get into this practice. I think I have several arts majors out in the class, or if any of you even played sports, you probably had a situation where a coach or a teacher or an instructor, or they will give you a correction and they don't want to have to give you the correction twice. Why? Because they're wanting you to apply it. And the only way that you're going to be able to apply it is by going through some sort of self-regulation cycle where you're trying to tell yourself, oh, I made that mistake the last time and the coach told me to go this way, or I've got to look at that, or I've got to make sure that I take a breath here before I try to play that note. Whatever it is, that's what we want our students to start engaging in. But unless we start to purposely have them, make them aware that this is something that they have to do, we're sort of leaving it up to fate or up to luck that they'll be able to do this on their own. So that's kind of the big change between the past times that I've had to teach this class to this new improved version of teaching this class, is making the students aware of how they can also self-correct and give self-feedback through the method of self-regulation. So I kind of talked a little bit about this already. The self-regulated learner is proactive learner. They are aware of their strengths and limitations. They are guided by personally setting goals and task-related strategies. You can help them by doing things like creating checklists and creating some sort of guide that can help them. If you're an ELA teacher or literature teacher and you're doing a lot of writing, maybe some of these students need to come up with a list of maybe 5 things that they're going to start doing on all their essays from here on out. Different people might have different lists. One student might have a very, very simple list where their list is making sure that I put my name on my paper and making sure that the first letter of every sentence is capitalized and making sure that I don't have a run-on sentence. But maybe somebody else has something that's a little bit more sophisticated because that's where they are in the writing process. So perhaps it's using sophisticated punctuation. Maybe it's varying the start of every sentence. Maybe it's starting to use more sophisticated clauses in their writing. That can be individualized. At the beginning of a new unit, maybe having a student write 3 things that they're going to improve on for this particular unit and having them put that someplace where they can see it all the time and they're always going back and self-correcting. And maybe the next unit you try something else. Like, these are effective strategies so that they can start to self-correct. The sooner we can get the students to self-correct the smaller things, then the more time that you have as their teacher to give them feedback on things that might be more complex. So this slide may seem completely out of context, but as I was reading the professor's book and I was looking at how I used to teach this class, the old material that I used to use to teach this class, and their arguments for the way the class is presented now, I happened to see something on either YouTube or television talking about the Amazon model and how the Amazon model was actually called the FLYWHEEL model. I don't know very much about mechanics and physics, but what I understood from watching this video, wherever I saw it, was that a flywheel is something that's very hard to get started at first. The momentum of the spinning starts to make it easier. If you remember way back in the day, Amazon started by just selling books. There was a point, I don't know, probably 20 years ago now, that they just sold books. And their idea was that books tended to take a lot of space in a store. If you remember the old Barnes and Noble and Borders, these were huge stores, and the reason why they had to have such huge stores is because the books were heavy, they required a lot of space, you had to have more than one. And so Amazon thought, well, if we take that away and we just keep the books in a warehouse where we really don't have to worry about marketing or anything like that, then we can give customers more selection. Okay, so that's where it kind of started with selection. And then if we could also give them a great experience, then we would start to drive traffic to our store. Well, what ended up happening is as more traffic started coming to Amazon, then they started bringing in their own like independent sellers. And so the sellers started to give more selection to the customers, and the customer experience improved. So that drove more traffic to Amazon, and they got even more sellers, and the selection got better. So see how this kind of like, at first it was kind of difficult to kind of get the wheel started, but then finally it just started running itself, and now Amazon is doing fabulously well. The monster that they are. As I saw this video about Amazon, I started to think of it in terms of self-regulation for a student, and I get the impression that they can be similar. If we think of the self-regulatory process as the same as the flywheel model that Amazon uses, then we can think of the students engaging in forethought before they try to self-regulate. They continue to think about what's happening during the performance, and then after they finish engaging in the activity, then they can reflect on how well they did, and then the next time they go to do the activity, they can think about what they learned or what they want to avoid or what they want to improve or what they did well before they engage in the activity, throughout the activity, after the activity, and it starts to take on this same sort of flywheel idea that the Amazon model reminded me of. The first phase for the student would be called the forethought phase, and that's when the student starts to think about what kind of goals are they going to set for their performance on a task. What is it exactly that they need to learn? That should be clear to them, and how they're going to decide on the outcome of the learning. At the same time as the forethought phase, then the students can also start to plan on how will this learning occur. And they can start to think about what kind of learning strategies have been successful for them, what kind of methods are designed that they're going to be exposed to so that they'll be able to attain these desired goals. The forethought phase is highly affected by what they call self-efficacy beliefs. And that is the student's belief of their personal capability to learn and perform. As a math teacher, I have a lot of students tell me, I've always had students tell me, I'm not a math student. I'm not a math person. I can't do math. As a teacher, I'm fighting against those self-efficacy beliefs more than I am necessarily fighting against their ability to do any sort of specific type of math. Another thing that we want to think about that students have to also contend with, and we as teachers have to be aware of, is how much does a student value the task? If the student doesn't value the task, will they necessarily continue to try to engage the material, and to what extent? I've heard from a lot of dance teachers that the students don't necessarily like to do the warm-ups before the practice. They like to perform, but they don't like to necessarily take the classes. But if they start to see the value of the class, that in class what you're basically doing is you're training your muscles to establish some sort of muscle memory so that you can be a better performer. Right? It can't happen just from performance. That comes from the basics of training your muscles to recognize when things are right, when you're on balance, when you're off balance, when you're in danger of hurting yourself, you're trying to avoid injury, when you're trying to learn to trust your partner. All those things come from working what some students might consider mundane components of taking a dance class. Students also need to have some sort of orientation. Why are they learning these things? Rather than just learning for the sake of learning. It's something that's on the syllabus, we have to learn it. We really want to think about the rationale and trying to have students understand the rationale of why something may be important to learn. For example, I'm a statistics teacher most of the time, and as a statistics teacher, my goal, what I'm teaching any sort of statistical calculation, is not the point of learning a statistical calculation. If a student can determine what the standard deviation is of a set of data by sticking it in the computer and punching out a number, that's not the overall rationale for learning statistics. The overall rationale for learning statistics, I believe, is that so you can look at presented findings, be it through media of any form, really, newspaper, television, and determine if what someone is stating as fact is actually possible. How are the findings verified? What is the sample size? How much bias is there? Things like that. I want my students to become better at evaluating the sources, more so than being able to calculate a number. Now, why do they need to calculate that number? Because ultimately that number is going to help them make judgment calls about how biased something is. Having the students orient their goal in the larger, more worldly rationale is important. Part of the loop would be the performance phase, and that's when the student is trying to engage in self-control. So at this point, the student is in the middle of the task, right? They're actually in the performance area, and they're trying to learn how to focus their attention. So trying to keep away from other distractions. You might see this with students when they are trying to do their homework and while they're also trying to text, while they're also having lots of distractions from their friends wanting their attention. My office is actually situated in the library at my school, and for it being a library, a lot of times it's very noisy, and I can't do my work with that amount of noise. I know this about myself, so that if I can figure out a way so that I can be working from my home when I'm doing something that requires a lot more focus, then I will plan accordingly. And I know that I need to focus my attention for a certain amount of time. There are ways that we can have students improve their focus. Things like, there's this thing called the Pomodoro timer, or the tomato timer. You can go online, and I'll actually link a link below in the description box if you want to check it out. And it's the idea that people are able to focus in 25-minute increments and take a 5-minute break, they're actually much more productive. Perhaps having your students engage in things, it doesn't have to be 25 minutes at first. If you want to teach your class how to focus attention during the writing process, maybe set a timer for 10 minutes and say, okay, for the next 10 minutes, we're just doing this. Because honestly, anybody can do anything for 10 minutes. So let's just everybody focus on this important material for 10 minutes, and then we're going to take a 5-minute break and do something else. And then we're going to go back for another 10 minutes. So it starts to teach them what things can they do to keep away from distractions, to self-focus, and also how to give themselves time to self-regulate and have conversations about how they're proceeding throughout the task and what things need to be improved and what things do they like and what things do they don't like and what needs to be revised throughout the process. During the process phase, as I've already stated, students are really engaging in some level of self-observation, observing themselves for the sake of being able to provide themselves feedback on their own. Things like this last one, recording the time it takes to perform a task. I don't necessarily record my time performing a task, but what I will do is I do use the tomato timer, 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off, 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off. I'll use my phone or set a timer for an hour, and then I will tell myself I'm not moving for an hour. I'll put my phone on airplane mode where only people that I'm most responsible for can reach me, and the rest of the time I'm just dedicated to getting something done. The last part of the student self-regulation phase, or the pre-assessment phase too, is the reflection phase. That's a time where after the task gets done, the student can self-reflect on how well they did. I'm sure you at some point in your job, or maybe even during an observation for your school, what's some of the first things that they'll ever ask you is, how do you think it went? How well do you think you did? What could you have improved on? And the idea of going back and self-reflecting and having an opportunity to evaluate your performance as a whole is something that also we need to start having students engage in. What have they learned about themselves? If they had to do something over, what one component would they change? And also looking at the idea of growth mindset, how are they attributing failure? If for some reason, if they're not happy with the product or the product was subpar, what was the reason why it was subpar? Was it because they were not ready? Was somebody talking? I mean, just getting some idea of to what the students are attributing the causes for the non-performance can give you an idea of where they might be able to grow. If they're attributing the failure for something that they cannot control, maybe moving towards students to like, well, what can you do to make things different the next time? Can you move if somebody is speaking too much? Can we bring in some sort of headphones, whatever it is? When you're looking at self-regulated learners, the most self-regulated learners will actually figure out a way to fix the situation before actually having to start to blame others or placing the blame on something that would be situational. Giving time for reflection, positive things can happen. The student might have feelings of self-satisfaction. They're proud of the work they did. There's evidence that would enhance motivation in future tasks. Whereas in the opposite, if they're not really happy with their performance, that could possibly undermine further efforts to learn. How can students maybe start to engage in forethought, considering something happened that might have affected the learning? What can they start to put in place as forethought for the next performance opportunity so that they can be ready? If they're in an area where there's a high amount of traffic and they weren't able to get as much done, could they find someplace else to go? If their favorite place to study is somebody else is sitting there, can they find someplace else that might be quiet? If their work schedules got changed, what other times can they find in order to be successful? How are they going to balance their time? For us as adults, for a lot of us, it might seem obvious, but for students that are in high school and dealing with a lot of different issues that come with adolescence, that might not be as obvious. So taking the time to look at it from the student perspective and then also start to distribute some of the ownership of feedback to the students while teaching them how to support their own learning practices is important. Just kind of coming full circle on this is that we really want the students to start to engage in this flywheel model, where the more forethought they have, the more effective their performance process will be, the greater their self-reflective will be. It'll influence their motivation perhaps, and then be able to put things in place so that future forethought and future performance will lead to more reflective practices, and that'll just become habit in the learner's learning pattern. Okay, and here's the little self-regulatory process, is the flywheel model. Again, I encourage you to think of yourself not just so much as a teacher all the time in this class, but then also as a learner. I've always been under the impression that people want to become better learners. They want to become more efficient learners. And perhaps by looking at the way that people become more self-regulatory learners, or they begin to self-regulate more efficiently, it might be something that is helpful not just as a teacher, but then also as a learner. So that brings us to the end of today's class. So I will see you for week 2 of the lecture. Bye.